Let me thank you for joining me and giving me an opportunity to share with the staff of City Hall and with any of our interested citizens just what in the world the mayor of a city like Atlanta is doing going to Angola. There are lots of things I had planned to do with a week's vacation in August. My wife was speaking down at Hilton Head, and we planned to take that week on the beach and on the tennis court, and it certainly would have been much more to my liking to do it that way. And yet I've had a long connection with Angola, and it was very hard for me to say no to an invitation to go to Angola. There were several reasons. One was that Angola right now is one of the focal points of all of the activity in the southern African continent. It's the part of southern Africa that maybe we are most involved with politically, and it's a part of southern Africa that I have been involved with since my Sunday school days in the Congregational Church in New Orleans, Louisiana. In Sunday school, we learned that there had been a mission station run by black Americans for over 75 years. And as I left seminary in 1955, my wife and I both applied to go to Angola as missionaries. Somehow the mission board didn't get our application together, didn't realize, though she was in Indiana and I was in Connecticut, that we were planning to go to Angola together. So they sort of put us on hold, and by the time they got us together and we got married, we were already here in Georgia. And by that time, the Portuguese were not allowing black Americans to go to Angola as missionaries anyway. And so there's been a long connection with Angola. And so when I went to Congress and got involved as a member of the Congressional Black Caucus with the struggle in Southern Africa, the issue that I pointed to was an issue that I knew something about, and that was Angola. And I helped to write the first amendment that ended up the Clark Amendment that tried to keep the United States from getting involved in Angola in the first place. The reason was that I knew most of these folk. Holden Roberto of the FLNA was Baptist. Augustino Neto, the son of a Methodist minister, a physician and poet, and Jonas Savimbi, a member of the United Church of Christ. Ironically, if I had gone to Angola when I did, I probably would have been one of Jonas Savimbi's teachers, and maybe I could have learned him something, at least not to get hooked up with South Africa. But as a member of the World Council of Churches program to combat racism, I had sat in meetings with people of all of these factions. And essentially, I knew them to be African nationalists, all of them products of Christian missionary education, most of the leaders educated in Europe. And they were essentially aligned with various political factions, not in terms of what their thoughts were, but in terms of who would support them. The CIA picked Holden Roberto. That was sort of a natural for them because he was probably the sorriest one of the lot. He hung around Zaire. He didn't do any fighting. He essentially said the things that they wanted him to say, and he probably put most of the money in a Swiss bank account, as his brother-in-law Mobutu was doing. And so we got very little, if any, involvement from Holden Roberto. Then Kissinger somehow switched to Savimbi. Savimbi's background was interesting in that he had been involved as a part of first FNLA and attempted to withdraw and move over to MPLA and blasted Holden Roberto for being a puppet of the CIA in the United States, and said that no African nationalists could be aligned with such imperialist forces and survive. And he made a bid to become a part of MPLA and was rejected. He was invited to come in as a member, but not given any particular leadership status. And so it was in the middle of this that we introduced an amendment urging the United States not to get militarily involved, but to try to find a political solution to the question of how we can unify Angola and help it in its transition from colony to independent nation. The Portuguese government had collapsed, and in January of 1975, all of these forces met in the Portuguese city of Alvor, and they reached what was called the Alvor Agreement. The Alvor Agreement pledged the three liberation movements to work together to try to unify the nation. But at the same time, in fact, the very next month, there are documents from the National Security Council Committee of 40, chaired by Henry Kissinger at the time, that show transfers of first large amounts of funds transferred to Holden Roberto, and an invasion by Holden Roberto with Zaire forces coming to try to attack the installation in Cabinda. Cabinda is an interesting sort of place, because it really isn't connected to Zimbabwe. I mean, here's Angola. Zaire comes through here, and Cabinda is out there by itself. And so that also happens to be where about $1 billion Gulf Chevron oil installation is, mostly offshore oil. The first move was by Holden Roberto and Zaire, Mobutu, to split off Cabinda and take the oil from Angola. The MPLA forces fought them off. That time there were no Cubans there. They were successful in beating back that operation. It was really several months later that in March that Savimbi pulled away and went to the south, I gather on the promise of help from the United States. That help turned out to be South African help. And in August of 1975, South Africa invaded to try to capture this little section down here along the Kunini River, where the Kunini Dam was located. Now, that started and then stopped. It was at that point, at the point of that South African invasion, that the Cubans came in. And by the time, that was when 286 Cuban advisors first joined in with MPLA. It was also when Russia stepped up its military support. Interestingly enough, Russia had not sent much military aid to the MPLA since 1973. And the period between 1973 and 1975 was a period when almost all of these liberation movements were relatively neutral. It was also during that period that representatives from the MPLA came to visit me in Washington. And they came to say to us, and to any other congressman who would meet with them, please don't do to us what you did to Cuba. Don't force us to be totally dependent on the Soviet Union. We're not going to turn our backs on the people who helped us gain our independence, but we know they will not be much help in developing our nation. And we want to maintain our relationships with the West. We particularly want good relations with the United States. And that was the message that I tried to get to, by that time, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. But by that time, it was almost always already too late. By that time, a major South African invasion had started and was moving up toward Luanda, fighting against essentially MPLA forces. The FNLA had, for all practical purposes, been beaten back in the north, and the northern part of Cabinda was essentially secure. But with a massive South African invasion of some 12,000 troops in August, and then again in September and October, you then got the first big airlift of Cuban troops. And that big airlift of Cuban troops, first with 700 troops, and finally it built up to about 20,000. And the chronology is important there because the United States did have an opportunity to work with all of the factions. It chose to work with one. That one failed, and then it chose to work with another. It basically chose the people that they thought they could control. The young Portuguese trained intellectuals in MPLA who didn't want to be anybody's puppets, didn't want to be pawns of the CIA or the US, or certainly not South Africa. They wanted to be an independent, non-aligned African state. They didn't even want to be pawns of Russia. In fact, one of the other ironies is that as ambassador to the United Nations, I learned of a coup attempt against Agostinho Neto. And the intelligence information that came to me through the non-CIA sources, the intelligence network around the UN, that was later confirmed for me by the Central Intelligence Agency, was that the coup against Neto had been orchestrated by Portuguese communists and the Russians, who were really upset that Neto was much too independent. And they wanted to put in his place Neto Alves, who was a man who was far less educated, not nearly so sophisticated and independent, that they thought they could manipulate. And so both the Russians and the US have made the mistake of trying to pick blacks that they could manipulate rather than trying to deal with authentic and intelligent leadership that has support from the people. And both have failed. Another little touch there was that one of the reasons why the Russians failed was that the Cubans backed Neto, Agostinho Neto. And it had something to do with the fact that the Angolans are all colors. Angolans and Cubans go from what we call high yellow to jet black, and anywhere in between. And they get along fine, and they do well together. The Russians seemingly have a hard time dealing with some of these racial subtleties. And basically, Russia likes puppets, just like the CIA has seemed to like puppets. And the only policy that can be credible in that area is a policy that essentially recognizes authentic leadership and begins to work out honest, straightforward deals with that leadership. Now, to prove that that's possible, Gulf Oil has done it. And Gulf Oil engaged the president of Nigeria, General Obasanjo, to mediate in setting up a contract between Gulf and the government. And they were willing to set up the contract in such a way that the money would be put on deposit, and whoever retained control of the country would then get it. So that during the period when there was an active civil war, Gulf never missed a day of pumping oil, because the MPLA faction and the Cubans protected them from the war, and most of the oil is about 12 miles offshore. And they're some of the largest and most sophisticated oil rigs anywhere in the world. Another reason why the Angolans don't want to be bothered with the Russians. The Russians don't know anything about drilling oil in 200 feet of water, 12 to 27 miles offshore. That's a technology that was developed off the coast of Louisiana in the Gulf of Mexico. And it's a technology that's mastered by folk from Louisiana and East Texas, who incidentally are running the oil rigs off of Cabinda. And so we've got a situation where we try our best to get a political settlement. The U.S. participates in wrecking that political settlement. Then the Cubans come in, and now we want to say we can't do anything with South Africa until the Cubans go. Well, that brings me to the second set of circumstances that led me to Angola. Angola is not an isolated incident. Here is South Africa. Here. Most of the rail lines from Zimbabwe run through South Africa, from Botswana, from Namibia, even from Mozambique. Except there are ports here at Maputo and Beira. There's a port here in Luanda, a port here in Namib. And Zambia used to send most of its copper out through the Benguela Railroad. Zimbabwe gets most of its oil and does most of its trade through the port up here in Mozambique and Beira. What we have seen happening since the Reagan administration came in was that South African raids have not only been in Angola, but have been recent raids on the port in Beira. They've been raids in Zimbabwe, in Botswana. Now, there are no Cubans in any of these places. And yet there have been South African raids that have been very destructive. Botswana may be one of the most democratic countries in the world right now. It's a peaceful democracy with little or no army, and yet they have been continually victimized by raids from South Africa. Inside, the little country of Lesotho has also been a victim of South African raids. And so there's a South African policy to destabilize all of this region, force them to be dependent on South Africa, and that's the reason, that's the way the South Africans hope to avoid sanctions. They hope to create such confusion in here that these countries realize that sanctions will hurt them. And so these countries then will give in to South Africa and help to forestall sanctions against South Africa. And the reason for raids on the ports here in Namib, Luanda, and up in Cabinda, and the raid in Beira and Maputo, is that South Africa is trying to avoid sanctions. But South Africa needs the Cubans there to keep the U.S. on their side. You see, none of this comes out in the press. And the only thing that we could get people to look at and to think about, and we had some very good and sophisticated reporters along with us, but they spent the whole time looking for Cubans, when all of the evidence was pointing to this village here destroyed by South Africa, to a raid on $1 billion American oil installation by South African commandos, one of whom was captured and 2 were killed, and a Captain William du Toit, who's an unrepentant Boer, who thinks it's South Africa's manifest destiny, 4 million, to control 200 million Africans south of the Sahara. And that they have locked Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan into a South African strategy. So when I go to Angola and begin to see these kinds of things, I really didn't intend to get this much involved. But I sort of feel like the little boy, you know, that stuck his finger in the dike when he saw it about to break, and nobody else was around. Nobody wants to be in that situation, but I began to stop and think, who else in the State Department do I know in African affairs or in the Secretary's office that has been following this as long as I have? When we used to meet regularly with the CIA as an ambassador to the United Nations, one of the things that they always had to admit was that my intelligence gathered from missionaries was more reliable than their intelligence gathered from paid informants who always told them what they wanted to hear. And so in order to get an accurate assessment of the situation, it almost becomes important to speak out and try to say, look, American policy since 1975 has been manipulated from Pretoria. And it's time to put a stop to that. This country, Namibia, since 1978, under UN Resolution 435, was supposed to have been independent. South Africa was supposed to withdraw. They have not. If they would withdraw and let Namibia become independent, and let Namibia, under UN supervision, hold democratic elections, that in itself will take care of the problems of Angola. If Savimbi has 1/3 of the country, which I doubt, the Angolan government will be forced to enter into negotiations with him. If Savimbi is just a South African puppet, he will probably disappear when South Africans pull out of Namibia. But under no circumstances should the United States be militarily involved in this area, particularly when it hasn't been that long ago that America's total security and domestic tranquility was dependent on West African oil. You remember 1974, 75, the oil embargo, the long lines. It was oil from right along here from Nigeria down to Cabinda that essentially made up the shortfall when the Straits of Hormuz were all jammed up, and when oil was not coming out of the Persian Gulf, it was African oil that essentially kept America secure and independent. As volatile as the situation is in the Middle East, I cannot understand why we allow South Africa to try to destroy a Gulf oil installation that provides about 300,000 barrels of oil a day to the United States consumer. And that's the reason I think it's very important for us to know what's going on in Angola and be prepared to urge our senators and our congressmen to do something to, first of all, separate the United States from South Africa. And next, to begin to get an independent Namibia so that we can get on a diplomatic approach to a peaceful and somewhat democratic Southern Africa. Maybe I'd better stop and let you answer your question.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to ask you one. As you were enumerating the reasons for your interest in Angola, you did not mention the fact that one of your closest aides and lifelong friend, Stony Cooks, just signed a huge contract with the government of that country to promote its cause in this country. So isn't it fair for me to ask you if you weren't just engaging in a public relations gesture when perhaps you might better have been home at City Hall looking after business?
Well, let me say, first of all, that that is the truth, but that I introduced Stony Cooks to Angola when he joined my staff. I had been involved with Angola about 20, 25 years before Stony Cooks. And what we saw, and one of the reasons why I encouraged him to do that, was that there has been literally a multi-million-dollar South African disinformation campaign which has been very successful in the United States. In fact, the fact that most people, including myself, would take for granted that Savimbi controls a third of the country. And yet in our visit, we were down here at Angiva and saw no military conflict whatsoever. We saw a village that had been destroyed in 1984 by South Africans. We drove from Lubango down to this is now Namib with no armed guard. In fact, I don't even know whether anybody had guns. The other thing is that if this whole area is controlled by Savimbi, why did Savimbi forces and South African forces massacre people at Mavinga? And why did the South African troops feel it necessary to invade Quito Carnival just the day we left Angola? That if this is controlled by Savimbi, why must South African troops come in and invade and destroy it? To the best of our knowledge and what we were told, which may or may not be true, there are about 10,000 South African troops down right in this part of the country that essentially protect that area for Savimbi. And there are another 20,000 South African troops protecting this border. Now, lest we get, I mean, this looks very small, but this is twice the size of Texas. And when you stop to think of the security problems that we're having along our border with Mexico, with all of our sophisticated technology, with all of our military personnel and everything else, we cannot protect or defend our border against drug traffic. It's virtually impossible for anybody, particularly a country of just 7 million people, to militarily defend all of this territory all of the time. So people can come in and go out and do damage. And the hit-and-run raids with South African logistics is basically what Savimbi is doing to destabilize the country. And I don't think it's in America's interest to support that.
I'm still asking if you didn't go because Stony Cooks got a contract from their government to promote their cause in the United States.
Well, I possibly would not have gone had he not. I might not have gone then. But I have on several occasions made efforts to go to Angola if I thought the situation called for it and if the cause was right. The main reason I agreed to go this time was that we were expecting a meeting of the frontline states. And that meeting was to be held on the 8th of August. It was postponed until the 21st of August, and it may not take place. But the Southern African Development Coordinating Conference, or SADC, includes all of the nations in Southern Africa. They were scheduled to meet. We were told by the foreign minister that they would be meeting there between the 8th and the 12th of August. And one of the reasons why we scheduled our trip for that time was to try to get there just a little ahead of them and hopefully be able to meet with some of them about another issue that I probably talked about before we're over, and that is sanctions against South Africa.
Does that mean that you can't believe everything the government of Angola says?
Well, it means that did not turn out to be the case yet.
Mr. Mayor, your heart is undoubtedly in the right place. And Southern Africa is, every cliche you can throw at it, a boiling pot. I mean, it's erupting, everything that you can think of. But you're the mayor of Atlanta. You obviously said that the State Department, you don't think that there's anyone there that knows the situation as well as you do. What are you going to do? I mean, are you going to become an ambassador without?
I think that that's, you know, one of the problems when you elect somebody like me mayor is you get all the baggage. I mean, you get all of the preaching, and you get all of the international politics. Now, it pays off, and I think I hope the citizens of Atlanta will have decided that, like, I don't want to go to Japan and China next month. It's the Chamber of Commerce that's trying to make me go. My wife doesn't want to go. This is not a good time for us. But they have set up interviews with Japanese business. One of the reasons why they want me to go is Japanese know I'm respected in other parts of the world, and I can get a bigger crowd in Japan for Atlanta because I do some of these things. I mean,
yes, but a Chamber of Commerce trip to China or Japan is not the same as going to Angola and then coming back the way that you are doing now. And I guess what I'm saying is people understand when you go on business development trips, but when you are ambassadoring, how much more deeply are you going to get into this? It's a serious situation,
really
no doubt.
I think that I'm going to always see to it that this city is run well, and I think this city is being run well, and if it's not being run well, since you elected me for 4 years, then my job is to get rid of the commissioners who are not running it well, or to help them to run it well. I have chosen to do the latter.
Does that mean that you're going to be spending a lot more time in Angola?
No, but it means that I'm not going to worry about, my contention is that that August, Ivan Allen went to South Africa.
No, I don't think that people, I think people are used to you traveling now. I mean, it's just that you seem to be much more intense.
Well, I'm going to be very involved in Angola and South Africa because it's one and the same thing. And I think the experience of Atlanta as a city is very relevant to South Africa. And I have not gone to South Africa in a good while. But anytime I can be involved in helping to resolve that situation in Southern Africa, minimizing the violence, so long as things are going well here, I will probably do it.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, there are very strong suggestions that the frontline states are not really in favor of sanctions against South Africa because of the adverse repercussions that could be posed on their countries. When you went to Angola, did you see any sign of Angola not being in favor of sanctions?
No, I think that all of the frontline states say they're in favor of sanctions, but they all know that they are going to suffer in some of those sanctions. But there again, that was my original reason for going, was to talk to them about the kind of sanctions that I think will work and not hurt them. And that is an airline embargo. It's a long way. It takes you about 13 hours to go from here to Europe. That's a long, long way. And then another 8 hours to come to the United States. There are about in 1978, there were about 2,000 seats every night leaving Johannesburg full of South Africans going to Europe. That's about 10,000 plus a week. Now, an airline embargo on South Africa, isolating these folk down here, really will not hurt the frontline states. And it will not hurt the black citizens of Soweto at all. Indeed, it will probably help the frontline states. When we just had this merger of service between British Caledonia and Sabina, one of the things that the British Caledonia chairman said was they're hoping to begin flight service into Gaborone in Botswana. I encouraged him to hurry up and do it quick, because it'll make a lot of money. Because if you close down flight service to South Africa, South Africans are still going to get out of there. But they'll drive to Botswana to fly. They'll catch a train to Maputo to fly. They'll go on up to Harare to fly. It'll take them an extra 6 or 8 hours. They might even help to build a larger airport in Lesotho. But they're going to get out. But it'll be at some apartheid for the first time will begin to inconvenience somebody white. And part of our theory of social change in growing out of the nonviolent movement is that on either side of an issue, there are only about 3% who are activists. And there are 3% of an issue who are actively opposed. There are 3% of an issue who are actively for. There may be another 15 to 20% that are friendly to the activists, but they don't get involved much themselves. But they will give lip service, they will contribute funds. But they really, are not actively involved. They're just friendly. That leaves you close to 60% in the middle that are a passive majority. And that when you begin to affect them, then they begin to have some impact on the 3%. When they say this system is not working, that 60% doesn't want to be involved. They want to be left alone to go on exploiting black folk and spending the money in Europe and America. They want to continue living the good life at anybody's expense. If they suddenly have to add another half a day to their travel, they suddenly have to go to Zimbabwe and spend the night, they'll get to see how black and white folk are living together in Zimbabwe. There are about 5,000 families in the last 18 months that have left South Africa moving to Zimbabwe. Because with all of the problems that they have in Zimbabwe, they don't have black and white problems. That civil war is over, and blacks and whites are living and working together. And so these are people, black and white, who want to stay in Africa.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I need to follow up this question, but I want to say something. Now, I have a report that says Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher has said that indeed these frontline states presidents have asked her to firmly stand against sanctions, because if that happens, their countries will be saved. But before you answer that question, let me just say something. Now, there are suggestions that a combination of financial and diplomatic cohesion that could be made to work would be the nearest thing to a compromise in the sanctions controversy. Do you believe in that?
Well, my program for Southern Africa would be that the president would go to the United Nations for an airline embargo and would give December 1st, 1986 as the effective starting date. That would give him another 5 months to negotiate changes. If then the South African government were willing to agree to the things that he himself said in his speech, that is, release Nelson Mandela, release all political prisoners and unban the political parties to participate in a democratic process, And he had a nice little list. I would only add to that if they would withdraw from Namibia. And if they would agree to those things by December 1st, there'd be no airline embargo. And then the president would have 5 months to do whatever he wanted to do, all of the coercion, but he would have a stick. And people would know that he's serious. But South Africa could do something, and that is accommodate to world opinion in ways that will not hurt them, but will simply give them an opportunity to live and work together. One of the things I think you've got to realize is, and they have to realize too, that even if there is a civil war, even if there is violence and bloodshed, when it's all over, there will still be some white folk there, and there will still be some black folk there, and they will have to figure out a way to work together. What I think sanctions can do, particularly if they're serious, non-destructive sanctions, but redemptive sanctions that help them to do the kinds of things that they want to do, just don't have the moral and political courage, is that I think it will help avoid the bloodshed and allow them to work out some way of living together before the killing gets any more widespread.
Mayor Young, just to make this clear now, were you and are you still working for Stony Cooks, and was this a one-time trip to Angola, or do you have definite plans to go back?
No, let me say, I have never worked for Stony Cooks. Stony Cooks really has only seldom worked for me. Stony Cooks was on the congressional staff during which he worked for the United States government. He was also on the United Nations staff during which he worked for the United States government. During the time that Stony Cooks ran my campaigns, I never paid him a salary. He has always been an independent operator. And we have been friends, and we have agreed on lots of things, and he's been very helpful to my political career. I would certainly do anything I can to help his business career. But my involvement with Angola and with Southern Africa basically depends not so much on Stony Cooks, but on what I think can be accomplished. You see, the other thing is that those folk need everything we've got in Atlanta. You can't just wait. Our nation is running a $150 billion trade deficit. One of the reasons I ran for mayor in the first place was that I felt that the United States has got to learn to trade, that we've got to learn to export our goods and services. Angola needs everything we make in Atlanta. They are going to have money to pay for it. And I just don't know why. You know, the Portuguese left there and they took 30,000 trucks. We've got a General Motors truck plant closed here. There's no reason why all those trucks had to come from Russia. Some of that Gulf oil money could have been buying General Motors trucks. And the people down in Hateville would have been working. And I see the demilitarization of the conflict in the third world as essential to America's ending its trade deficit and coming out of an economic sluggishness that basically right now is, you know, we're compiling debt and deficits in almost every quarter. And somewhere we've got to get out of that. This is a nation that's going to be very rich. The guys on the oil rigs, when I said this looks just about like Louisiana, they said not only does it look like Louisiana on top of the water, but the geology is essentially like Louisiana in East Texas. I said, well, you've been pumping oil down there for 50 years. I can remember seeing those rigs out when I was a baby. He said, well, we'll be here another 50 years in these oil fields. And I heard from Chevron that one of the Chevron engineers, that in the merger of Chevron and Gulf, one of the key aspects of that acquisition that enabled them to pay the price that they paid to acquire Gulf was the Chevron estimate of these oil fields and the oil potential off the coast of Angola. Now, I don't know why the United States government will give missiles and bombs to somebody to blow up an American investment that is providing a steady supply of fuel and heating oil to the American citizens. Now, I would be involved there whether or not Stony Cooks was involved. What Stony is involved in is something that I think is very necessary for third world countries. That is, they need to be represented in Washington. They need somebody just to let people know where these countries are. Every country that has done well with the United States has had good representation in Washington.
I'm curious if you've heard anything from the Reagan administration or of State Department officials, either when you were in Angola or since you returned.
I went to see them before I went. Not about this. I really went to see them about the Cubans in the Atlanta penitentiary. But after we talked about that, not very satisfactorily, we got into a long discussion on Southern Africa. And they basically know what I think.
You are actually actively involved in Angola now because of the benefits you can accrue for Atlanta, or because of the progress it is making?
Oh, I think it's all, I never try to dissect my motives. They're all very, very complicated. And I never claim any great purity. I will say I don't gain anything financially out of this, but I sure have a lot of fun. Particularly when you think, you know, just by a little extra stuff. For instance, I've written 2 or 3 op-ed pieces for various newspapers. I'll continue to do that. And that means that, you know, at night when I can't sleep, instead of watching television and, you know, reruns of boxing matches, I sit down and write. I figure that's a better use of my time, you know, than the kind of goofing off. It maybe takes a little time away from my family and the beach, but I try not to do that too much.
I'll go back then to what I asked you before, and that is that this seems like not a radical departure, but somewhat of a departure. You've always been a man who has been engaged in heartfelt interests or following your conscience, the dictates of your conscience. And this situation certainly merits such action, but are you going to be, I remember the other half of the phrase now, ambassador without portfolio, not just, I don't mean just leaving Atlanta, but I mean, is this going to be something that you're going to be standing up for, not just as mayor of Atlanta, but as a private citizen or a public person?
Well, as I'm called on. And you see, I very seldom, in fact, if ever, ask anybody for permission to write an article. They usually ask me if I will write something. And if somebody asks me, I will write it. If somebody asks me to go on somebody's talk show, as Charlie Rose did, I'll do it. But I'm not organizing a PR campaign in behalf of Angola. I am organizing a PR campaign amongst the members of the House and the Senate. And I will write letters to them based on my information. In fact, the first place I went when I came back was to the Hill to talk with some of my friends in Congress who are on the House Intelligence Committee to just try to discuss with them some of the things that I saw and give them some of the right questions to ask about the intelligence information that they're receiving.
Mr. Mayor, your involvement in helping to promote the interest of these African countries actually can be highly commendable. Are you going to ensure that you get other African countries, especially the frontline states, involved in your, quote, public relations campaign, and not only Angola?
Well, I know the other this was the first time I had been to Angola. I've been to Zambia 6 times. I've been to Zimbabwe 6 times. President Samora Machel was here. I am on much better terms with all of the rest of the frontline states than I am with Angola. And so I have always worked with them to try to help Americans understand just what's going on in Southern Africa. This is a long ways away, and there's no reason why the average American should be aware of what's happening. But it's like Vietnam. We weren't aware of what's happening until it was too late. and we were deeply involved financially and militarily. And I think Dr. King was right when he said the bombs we drop on Vietnam will explode at home. Well, what we have now is we see yesterday the rebels from the Sudan this time shooting down a civilian airliner with a, with a rocket. I don't know whether it was, well, they said it was a Russian rocket. But the guy who's leading the rebels in the Sudan is a graduate of Grinnell College in Iowa and has a PhD from Iowa State University. I don't know why the Russians would give him guns. He has not had a history of Russian association. He, too, is a product of the Christian missionary educational system in southern Sudan and attended Grinnell College on a scholarship and went on and got a PhD from Iowa State. So that I just don't think it's good to have a lot of ragtag rebel groups with missiles that can shoot down airplanes, because you never know who gets the hold of those missiles. And, we didn't want to give Saudi Arabia Stinger missiles. And why would we give them to Savimbi? To blow up Gulf oil and to shoot down Lockheed C-130s, which is what they have done.
What do you think is wrong? What has happened to Kwame Ture in Guinea?
Well, I talked to the Guinean ambassador this morning, and he assured me that Kwame Ture, or Stokely Carmichael, as some of us knew him, had been placed under house arrest Friday night, and then he was taken from his home. He was not questioned. His wife was allowed to visit him, but he was released this morning. So he has been released. That has since been confirmed by the State Department.
Mr. Mayor, I don't know if I understand you properly. You seem to be saying that you are concerned about the economic benefits to Americans. You are concerned about security benefits to Americans if they did something about the Angolan situation. Aren't you saying that you agree with the motives of the present architects of American foreign policy, while you disagree with the methods they're using to solve these problems?
Well, let me say that I am an American, and I agree that America's foreign policy ought to protect America's interests. I think America's interest in Southern Africa are legitimate interests. I also happen to think that America's interest in Southern Africa are African interests. And so I don't see any conflict between America's interests, say, and the interest of the government of Angola. I don't see any conflict between America's interest, long-term interest, and the interest of blacks in Soweto. I think ultimately blacks in Soweto are going to need to be a part of a free market system. They're going to need to develop their raw materials and their natural resources. They're going to need to develop their talents and their skills to improve their quality of life, to develop housing, to feed their hungry and to clothe their naked and to heal their sick. And I think America is uniquely able to provide those kind of opportunities for Africa. And I think that when they do it, they're going to be protecting both America's interests and African interests. I think right now, I don't know what President Reagan's concept of America's interests are. I don't know. I mean, there's no American interest to be served by a closer association with the Botha regime in South Africa. There's no American interest being served by giving Savimbi missiles to blow up $1 billion private investment of an American company that's now being defended by Cubans. It doesn't make sense at all. The whole thing is a mess. And I just figure if people look at their own interests and are honest about them, they'll probably come up with better long-range policy, and they'll find that the human interest is of more significance and is universal enough to encompass everybody's national interest.
Mr. Mayor, what would your attitude be if the people in the countries you're talking about decide that they need a redistribution of wealth, of power, very different from the American system?
Well, I would say that I would do everything I could to convince them that they're wrong, and I tell you why. I think that the socialist theory of redistributing wealth works only insofar as it continues to generate wealth. If a redistribution of wealth drove all of the technocrats out of the country, you probably would have a disintegration of the society rather than a real redistribution. I think the experience of Zimbabwe, and I think the experience even in socialist Angola, is that while they have socialist education, that is free education from the first grade right on through university, while they have free medical care, they have preserved a large sector of agriculture. Collective agriculture hasn't worked anywhere in the world. I don't think it'll work in Africa. It hasn't worked in Russia. It hasn't worked in China. It hasn't worked where it's been tried in Africa. General Obasanjo of Nigeria put it this way. He said, nobody will stay up all night to care for the government's pig. If it's your own pig and the pig is sick, you stay up and take care of it. If it's the government sick, you let it die. Pig, you let it die. So agriculture requires a kind of personal commitment, and it requires a kind of personal loss of profit to get folk to work as hard as you got to work on a farm. Now, Angola realizes that, and one of the biggest and most successful farms that we visited there was a private farm run by a young fellow of Portuguese descent whose family has been running that farm for 47 years. And he is continuing to run it as a private farm. And it's very successful.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Mayor. Well, first of all, my name is Mohammed Silla from the African World News. I'm speaking in the context of a journalist. There are very strong suggestions that the United States and Great Britain are reluctant to change apartheid because they don't believe that the blacks are capable of ruling themselves or ruling the country in the interest of the United States and Britain. As such, you rather let the whites rule South Africa. I mean, do you think that is sensible, or is there any
Well, I
reason
don't
to
think it's
believe in that?
sensible, but neither do I believe it's true. I mean, Margaret Thatcher sees Zambia, and she sees Zimbabwe. She gets along quite well with Robert Mugabe, now that he's the president. But Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan have another problem. That problem is in the ideological right wing, the neo-fascist wing in their own parties. And that's the wing of their politics from which they come. And that's the wing of their politics that's continuing to hold them back. Now, I think ultimately they will come around. Remember, Margaret Thatcher came around on Zimbabwe. And interestingly enough, it was the conservative government from Australia that helped her come around. Well, when I was in London, Sir Malcolm Fraser was there meeting with Margaret Thatcher and with General Obasanjo in the context of the Commonwealth. Just as we are having to put pressure on our Congress to help them understand what's going on, members of the Commonwealth are having to help Margaret Thatcher to understand that Britain really can't survive as an isolated economic entity. They need the Commonwealth. They need the European community. Both the European community and the Commonwealth are advocating some kind of aggressive sanctions, not because they want to destroy South Africa, but because they want to see South Africa have a chance. Let me just go on while I'm waiting for my brother there to get his question together and say, let's remember, it was sanctions that helped us change. It was sanctions, the threat of sanctions by the Supreme Court, that made us integrate in the South. It was the sanction of a boycott by the citizens of Atlanta that brought us together, and we became a city too busy to hate. and we've been doing very well ever since. But it took that sanction to get us on the right track. It was the sanction that made American business open its doors to black Americans. They could no longer get government contracts if they didn't hire blacks. It was sanctions that opened the University of Georgia. And the Army had to come down to help open the doors of the University of Mississippi. Now the University of Mississippi has a higher per capita black population than the University of Michigan. I mean, we've seen change occur very positively in the South because of sanctions. And sanctions don't destroy people, and they don't destroy property. And I would hope that President Reagan, if President Reagan had been in the South, if he had known what went on down here, but see, he was in Hollywood when all the change was going on. And nothing like this happened in Beverly Hills. And his view of the world is really a Beverly Hills view.
Mayor Young, I'm Herbie Denmark from the Atlanta Voice newspaper. I would like to ask you, now that the House and the Senate have passed sanctions bills, they might differ. Do you think it's too late for you and others to spread this information to the House and to the Senate concerning what's going on in Angola?
No, I went to meet with the Senate, and one of the senators, well, everything I've been advocating is in the bill. It requires some fine-tuning by the administration, though. The Congress can't implement sanctions. Ultimately, the State Department and the President are going to have to implement those sanctions to make them work. And I think Secretary Schultz understands that. And I think that, I don't know what's the problem in our decision-making right now, but it's really not all bad. I'm more optimistic about the situation there now than I've ever been before. I could never have imagined, even 3 months ago, that the Senate of the United States would vote 84-14 to put sanctions on South Africa. That's a tremendous accomplishment. That says democracy is working. The people have spoken. The senators have to face election, and so they're getting themselves in order to go before the people in November. That's the way change occurs in our society. Let me thank you very much. I hope that this has been as informative for you as it has for me. It's really made me, I have known Africa for a long time, been very much involved, but this forced me to go back and read some of the articles that I'd missed. It forced me to look a little more closely at the geography to try to understand exactly what's going on in Southern Africa. And I'm convinced that Southern Africa's future is really dependent on America's understanding of how her interests are going to be expressed in realizing that future. I think there is a commonality of interest that's best expressed not only by Gulf and Chevron, because Lockheed has done business with Angola, Arthur D. Little, Chase Manhattan Manufacturers Hanover, Solomon Brothers was there with us. American business, I think of as the front line of defense, both in development and in helping to protect some of America's interests. And I hope that the big business Republican administration in Washington can begin to understand that fairly soon and see if we can't work out some accommodation that does not require the destruction of either person or property in Southern Africa. Thank you very much for being with us, and let me thank the members of the press for being willing to work with us on this occasion. Thank you.